You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
Well, going back to the question, basic questions about interest, or what the Gemara, what the Talmud calls the dust of interest, avat ribit, some kind of transaction that seemingly creates interest, even though interest is not directly specified. And we've learned that the rabbis are really quite anxious about handing over money to a trader with which that trader can make profits. If we're financing a trader, then effectively, and if the trader pays us for that financing, effectively we're paying him to run a business. And if he brings us interest, well, that's definitely dust of interest, avak ribit. And the Mishnah is going to continue on this theme now. We're in the 7th Mishnah of the 5th chapter, in discussing situations where we're creating forward prices. So very common in today's commodity markets that you might trade for delivery forward 3 months at some future price. The rabbis are quite anxious about this kind of trading going on before the spot market price is actually known. Obviously, if the spot market price is known, then the trade has to take place at that price. We can't pay a different price for future delivery from the price we pay for current delivery in general. But so the Mishnah begins, Ein poskim ala perot ad sheyetzeh hasha'ar. We don't trade in produce before ad sheyetzeh hasha'ar, before the market price is known, before it's publicized. It's difficult to figure out what is going on here, but it seems as if the anxiety is that once the market price is known, it'll be apparent that the seller or the buyer is making a profit from this transaction. He's making, let's say, a capital gain. What is he's making a gain from this transaction that's analogous to interest, and we don't want to do that. So we're not going to trade before the market price is known, or at least we're not going to do that if neither party has got stock on hand. Because if the stock is in hand, of course, he's not relying on any future price to deliver. He can deliver immediately. And that's how the Mishnah continues. If he was the first person to make the harvest, so he's got the grain basically stacked up on his threshing floor. He may not have threshed it yet, so it may not be ready exactly for delivery, but he's basically harvested his grain. He's got the inventory, so he could, in theory, deliver at that price. That's the point the Mishnah is trying to make. He could deliver. Hayahu t'chilala kotzrim. So he was the first to harvest. Posekimu al hagadish. He can trade a price with him for stacked grain. This is unthreshed grain, by the way. So it's not quite ready for delivery, but, well, I mean, I guess it could be delivered unthreshed. Ve'hala evet shel anavim. And on a basket of grapes. The evet is some kind of giant basket they used to collect the grapes in. Ve'al ha'maten shel zeitin. On a vat of olives. Again, we're talking about the kind of containers that people used to carry out the harvesting in. Ve'al ha'beitzim shel yotzer. This is really striking off sideways. Beitzim are lumps or eggs, literally. We're talking about lumps here. Shel yotzer, shell of a potter. So a potter hasn't yet made the pots, but he's got the clay ready to turn into pots. Ve'al hasid misha yishakar kivshano. And as soon as limestone is basically sunk in the kiln. So when we've got the produce available, we seems to be that we can trade a forward price, because it's clear that the seller can just deliver the produce. There's no question of a gain in market prices. And along the same lines, and he can trade in manure any time of the year. It seems that maybe this is obvious or natural, but manure is always available because animals are always churning out manure. So it seems that, we can always go out in the marketplace and buy manure. So we can trade manure at any price without fear of some gap until a forward delivery and an increase in price. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ein posekimu al hazevel ad sheyehelo zevel ba'ashbot. And Rabbi Yossi says you can't trade in manure until he's actually got it in his dung heap. So the same principle, like the corn being harvested, the dung has to be actually sitting on the dung heap before he can trade it. But Chachamim matirin, the sages actually permit it. Rabbi Yossi is stricter than the sages will go. Posek imo kashar hagavoha. This is where the Mishnah becomes more difficult to understand. He can fix a price at the high price. In other words, at the highest possible level. Rabbi Yudah explains here, even if he didn't set the price, in other words, regardless of whether he set a price or not, tenli kazeh or tenli et ma'otai. Give me at this price or give me back my money. So the buyer always has the possibility, it seems, according to Rabbi Yudah, of going back on his deal. Now, we've already said that someone who goes back on a deal is treated like the generation of the flood. It's a terrible thing to go back on a deal. But it seems as if when we're talking about a forward price, if I offered just to buy something in the market today at today's price, it's considered really objectionable to go back on that. But if we're talking about a forward price, and it's kind of understood on both sides that the price that might develop in future is different, then yes, I can go back on my deal. I can say, look, no. I know I contracted at $10 per ton, but the market price has gone back down to $5 per ton. So give it to me at $5, or we're just going to unwind the whole deal. The Mishnah does allow, however, certain amount of trading on a like-for-like basis. Malvei adam et asirav chitin bachitin. So a person can lend his tenants wheat to be repaid in wheat. So usually, again, going back to these anxieties about changes in market prices, we could lend $10 worth of wheat, but we be repaid in $10. So the price is quite clear. $10 has gone out, $10 coming back. There's no argument about it. But in the case of an asir, a ris, a sharecropper, there's someone who I think that Mishnah here is making an economic concession that the sharecroppers don't have wheat to plant. Sometimes unless the landlord actually lends it to them. So the landlord can lend the tenants wheat for wheat to be repaid in wheat. Zera avalola ochal, for planting, but not for food. So for food, we are really anxious about essentially lending on interest. We might be demanding back more than what we're sending out. But as far as seed is concerned, it seems like the Mishnah is making an exception here. And it's going to quote Rabban Gamliel. Although Rabban Gamliel is going to take this to an extreme. But again, we'll see how the great sages used to behave. And remember, again, as we've said many times through this tractate, we're not just learning about financial issues, but we're learning about, well, how people treat one another. שהיה רבן גמליאל מעובד אריסיו חיטין ביוקר והוזלו. He used to lend wheat to his tenants at high prices, and sometimes it would get cheaper. Or v'zol v'hokiru, and sometimes he lent at low prices, and it later became expensive. So he has a possible loss in the first case and a possible gain in the second case. What's he going to do? V'notel mehen kashar hazol. He'd always take back at the cheaper price. He'd always take back at the cheaper price. Lo she halacha ken. Not that the halacha worked according to that principle. Ela sheratza lahachmir al atzmo. Because he wanted to be strict on himself. And we see elsewhere, by the way, Rabban Gamliel used to be rather easy on himself. For example, in terms of taking a bath while being in the period of mourning. But in terms of interpersonal issues, he seems to have been strict on himself, at least in terms of the way he treated his tenants.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.